Data, Nepal. Dr. Rai is a computer scientist, educator, and writer. She currently serves as the Director of Research and Development of Body and Data, a non-profit organization advocating for digital rights and feminist interests. She holds a PhD in computer science from Rochester Polytechnic Institute, USA, with a research focus on the use of artificial intelligence in education. She has worked as a software engineer, designer, researcher, and educator teaching in Nepal and the USA. She has developed technology platforms for youth education and initiated educational programs in data science and machine learning. She writes about socio-political issues in Nepal. Welcome, the two of you. So we'll start with your opening remarks, Aarathi. You can tell us a little bit about how the DPI evolution took place in India. And now that India is looking to export DPIs, what are the initiatives for India to push for this, the replication of DPI adoption in other countries, and what opportunities are other countries seeing?
Hi, am I audible now? Sorry, I think there was a connection issue.
Yeah, you're audible. We can't see
Okay.
you though, but we are audible.
Sorry, yeah, I'm back. Yeah, then. I completely missed your question though. So sorry if you could just start again.
I was saying maybe you could start with telling us about how India's DPI evolution took place over the years, and what are the key initiatives for India to export its DPIs to other countries, and what are the opportunities that other countries are seeing with India's DPI revolution? Looks like Aarathi is having a connection issue. We'll just wait for a second. Dr. Rai, maybe we can come to you till Aarathi figures out her internet. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how Nepal's DPI revolution is happening right now, and how is the adoption happening, and what are the opportunities that the country is seeing with respect to DPI adoption?
Okay, thank you, Angela. So yeah, so in context of Nepal, yeah, I just want to give a little background that, Nepal, I think that compared to other South Asian countries, Nepali government has been a little kind of like, let's say, late in kind of coming up with the digital framework and these digitalization initiatives relatively. But given Nepal, we have such a huge migration within the country and also the, country and a lot of youth population. So the citizens themselves are very, in the digital space. There's a lot of high digital engagement. So we are in this kind of very interesting situation where a lot of, the population is highly digitalized. They are like in the digital space, and government is kind of like, launching new digitalization initiatives and this new DPI initiative. And at Body and Data, we just finished this research on the national ID. How government, as because it's like a biometric ID, and the government is trying to launch it as one of the major DPI initiative. Previously, it has launched Nagarik app, but which has kind of the very mixed, reception. And with the national ID, uh, based on our research, what we can see that it was very rushed. It was like, I think the government or the people who were involved in the envisioning program and implementing it, they were kind of very enamored about the idea itself, right? Okay, we are having this huge digital DPI initiative. So I think there was a lot of excitement and lot of this about it, but I think their bandwidth is kind of captured by, okay, bringing this new technological intervention. There is not a lot of forethought or planning and looking at diverse, multitude of this initiative. And it was launched like very in a very hurried fashion, without kind of like thinking, because they said it's a DPI initiative, but there was not that kind of this framework or the infrastructure planning or thinking. It was like brought as a very standalone initiative. And right now, I think the government is kind of, because there's no this very holistic planning and framework. So this initiative is kind of like, the government is finding difficult to justify, because without that, that technological, that infrastructure framework, it's very difficult to kind of like uh, uh, you know adoption. So we are really, I think the government kind of struggling to have a widespread adoption and even justify, like, why do we need this national ID in the first place. I think Aarti is back. Maybe you can uh go back to her.
Yes,
Hi,
I hope I'm
Aarathi.
audible and visible now. I'm really sorry
Yes,
about
yes,
this.
yes, you are. Would you like to make your opening statements now?
Yes, I didn't catch your question. I'm so sorry. So you may
Okay.
proceed.
So I was basically asking you if you could share some light on how India has been involved in its DPI adoption journey, and how what are the incentives for India to actually export DPIs to various countries, and what are the opportunities that other countries are looking at with respect to India's DPIs?
Right. So, in terms of India's DPI story, it starts off in 2009 with Aadhaar, which was the sort of landmark ID program that India launched back then. Of course, it took a couple of years for people to get onto the system. The original idea was that this would help facilitate seamless government to person payments, and that's essentially what it was used for initially. Then you had over the years the development of the India Stack, which is really the main thing that they're trying to export, at least at a policy narrative level, which is your Aadhaar and or sort of e-verification or KYC services, which identify beneficiaries or citizens, then interoperable payments to facilitate participation in the digital economy at the last mile, and then also data exchanges that facilitate this entire sort of digital ecosystem in a consent-based manner. So, of course, India's journey has been impressive in terms of building about these things on a relatively smaller budget compared to most countries for a very large population. I think the elephant in the room amidst a lot of the noise that's coming out on DPI is also, there's been a lot of issues of exclusion, despite the inclusion. And also, a lot of things have been thought about in hindsight. So I think there's been a lack of attention to legislation, to regulatory structures, to authorizing environments, which has led to highly exclusionary outcomes and potentially invasive outcomes for the citizens of this country. And of course, the government does take steps to recognize it, but I think there is still some way to go. And hopefully, as we move forward on this journey and we see many more types of DPIs emerging in the market domestically, civil society such as SFLC and government actors can come together to mitigate those issues. In terms of what India sees as a benefit from exporting DPI, if you look at a lot of the ministerial statements that have come out over the last few years at relevant summits, I think it's a huge sort of, what's the word? It's a huge opportunity for India to establish itself in a very different kind of world order. I have an international relations background, so I see it that way. In the 60s, 70s, you had sort of India positioning itself as the head of a non aligned movement and sort of bringing together the global south under that rubric. And right now, maybe those divisions are not so pertinent anymore. So, what are the ways in which you can engage the global south in a world which is fundamentally shaped by technology and give it back that very precious thing, sovereignty? And DPI is kind of the answer to a lot of those problems. So, at a policy messaging level, I think that's really the opportunity that India is looking at. In terms of what countries are expecting from India, I think there's also a lot of presumption in the idea that we are exporting to the world because a lot of countries are anyway doing DPI on their own. So it's not like they're ready to just import DPI. They've already tried and are attempting with relevant multilateral partners to build those ecosystems on their own terms, however successful or unsuccessful that might be. So I would say that's something to maybe reframe the idea of India as an exporter. Maybe India can be a supporter or an enabler of these ecosystems as well. And in terms of what countries are looking for, I think it really is very, very country specific. But ultimately, I think if you're looking in the long term at building sustainable DPI ecosystems that actually work for decades to come and continue to build and bring more sections of society into its fold, then you really need technical capacity um, in your domestic countries to maintain those ecosystems. And I think technical assistance is something that you're seeing lots of countries, especially smaller countries that are trying to build these initiatives, are really seeking support for, whether it's in terms of knowledge sharing on how to build these ecosystems or actual skilling initiatives that can help create workforces that sustain for the future, and also are trained in sort of rights respecting practices as well. So those would just be my initial opening remarks, but happy to uh, talk further on anything else. Thank you.
Good. And thank you, Aarathi. That's actually you have summarized the DPI journey quite well. Over to you, Dr. Rai. So you initially mentioned about how the challenges that Nepal has been facing with respect to its DPI journey. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on what are these challenges and how are they maybe similar to the challenges that India has already faced, and whether there's anything, whether what are the ways in which you're looking at how it can be better with this journey going forward?
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm going to like again base a lot of my conversation on the our recent research on the national ID initiative. Again, so I think it was very great to hear from Aarthi that the India has been able to launch this other at least with some kind of technical competence within small budget, relatively smaller budget than other countries. So what we are seeing in Nepal is like I think we lack even the technical competence. And because I was kind of looking at different resources, like what is our data governance framework, what because whatever information or even our National ID Act, it is very limited. So it feels like the project was kind of like some people got the because it's a very massive, it's a very huge investment. I think it's the Asia Development Bank that is investing on this. So like for a small country, right, is some other institution giving us money, and then we have outsourced this to IDEMIA, another French company. So we are getting money from somewhere, we are getting technical support from technical competence from somewhere. So it feels like we have not really built our own homegrown vision, our homegrown technical ecosystem or even competence. So the incompetence is really glaring. And even in the implementation, we saw that like how this how this particular company was chosen to implement that, it has not been clarified. There's a lot of conflict of interest. So yeah, if I have to start, because the DPI is for, we say it's for the administrative efficiency, right? Even that very fundamental first step, we are not able to see that it is really delivering that efficiency itself, right? Rather than it is looking at some kind of like added on how to say, like some bloated expenditure. And actually the citizens were not made aware why it is for and people were saying, oh, it's like Aadhaar, but then computer, because at least with Aadhaar card, right, people are going to get some welfare services. Our national ID, it doesn't, it's just some kind of linking, it's just like some additional bureaucratic paperwork. And the government is really not able to justify why it is, and because I think they want to justify the process, so they want to have higher number of enrollment. So what they are doing is actually they are making people some kind of mandatory provision. For example, if you because we have a lot of people going abroad, right, as migrant worker, as student. So now to get your passport, you have to get this NID, that's not national ID, right? So rather than offering something to the citizen and making them choose to take this ID, the government is kind of like making this mandatory provision. so that the citizens are kind of obliged to do it. And I think a lot of marginalized communities are, say, like from the disabled communities, they are kind of like, oh, you need to get this ID so that you are not going to lose whatever the welfare you are getting from the government, but there's no clarity. So and yeah, it just like I mean, the inclusion aspect, I mean, I think we're going to talk later, that has not been, but even like, even to start with, right? Like, yeah, so that's why it's kind of very um weird that, oh, we are bringing this for the administrative efficiency, and it is actually creating more inefficiency rather than the efficiency. So I think we really need, I think Aarti mentioned about this kind of sharing of skill. I think in Nepal, we really need some kind of like this administrative, this technological, this kind of capacity to even, implement it, or to even create this kind of DPI framework. So yeah, that has been my reading.
That actually brings that you have actually brought up quite a lot of points. So one main question that I actually have from this is, in India also we have seen how private sector players are closely involved in the building of DPIs. So what do you think about the involvement of private sector players? DPI, for instance, is being showcased as something what the government does for the people. So is private sector involvement ideal? Is there how do you balance it out with the government and private sector involvement? What are your thoughts on private sector involvement in DPI development? Both you, any of you can take this up.
Please feel free. I mean, I can go first if that works. Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think, I mean, it depends again on the government in question, how you're designing DPI. And that is actually something. So I'm currently co-steering research with a bunch of colleagues at the Quantum Hub on how governments around the world are designing and thinking about DPI. And the Indian model, which is where you have these public infrastructures that the private sector can then come in and participate on, isn't necessarily a universal model or a universal approach. So for some countries, it's very much a closed ecosystem that they're thinking of. And even if they're not deliberately thinking of it that way, just the way it's being conceptualized right now, the private sector is not really participating. In some countries, your whole payments ecosystem, everything is being shaped by the private sector. I think ultimately, if you're trying to deliver public services to the citizens of a country, uh, there is a question of capacity also in developing countries as well, which is ultimately the set of countries that DPIs are purportedly useful for. So you may require capacity assistance. What I think is the issue is, which we're also seeing in some cases in India, I can't speak to other countries. I would love to hear Dovan's thoughts from Nepal as well, is that the private sector participation shouldn't end up becoming monopolistic. It should actually facilitate an ecosystem where people can fairly compete and fairly participate in these manifold benefits that are accruing from DPIs. And I think that is a question, again, that we're thinking about in hindsight in India, as opposed to trying to preempt when designing the frameworks and the thinking around these systems as well. So that's an issue. And I would also, on the private thing, this is not entirely related, but I think it's also important to think about the structuring of the entities and the authorizing institutions that are overseeing DPI ecosystems. We've seen in some cases in India, and this is thanks to stellar reporting by some of my colleagues at Medianama, where I used to work, Saraswati NT specifically. We've seen that a lot of overseeing authorities have been sort of public facing, seem to be sort of government offices, but it's unclear whether they are actually operating in such a way and whether they are uh, sort of held to the same standards of accountability as such an office would be. So again, when we're looking at digital public infrastructure, which has such a high impact on citizens and has such a high ability to shape the way lives unfold. Accountability, both from the state and from the private sector actors participating, is very important. And that should be embedded into regulatory frameworks for countries that are thinking about uh, looking at these tech systems as well.
Dr. Rai, your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Okay. So in Nepal, I think private sector has done some like commendable job in laying out the DPI, the components and some structures, because as I said, Nepal's digitalization journey, it is not necessarily top down, because I think our government was again very, because we had so many like political turmoils and everything. Government has been a little late in this, but I think it's the people themselves, and a lot of private entities. They were kind of laying out some groundwork, and one good example is the digital payment system. There were a lot of because I think yeah, so yeah, some these private companies, they not only brought that, but they also actually worked in a lot of financial, fintech literacy, because I really highly commend them for doing that, because they had to do the role of what government had to do, because government was not necessarily there adequately. But having said that, I think if I look at Nepal's private tech sector, there's this kind of a little, I think maybe it's also similar to other countries, but here they feel a little kind of like, they feel like they are not accountable, they don't feel accountable. This. So there's a little bit of like a self aggrandizement, and some self pity, so they feel that they are the victim of not having an educated government support, so they don't held themselves to the high standards of accountability. So they might feel like not so responsible, ensuring that they have the ethical practices, ensuring that, again, as Aarti mentioned, not monopolizing. They are kind of keen to kind of making pact with the government to get, because we have a lot of these things, because I think that a lot of government, this technological, this the tenders, they have some kind of backdoor agreement, and they get those tenders without the due process. And our current prime minister has been accused of having those companies that kind of get those contract based on the personal relationship. And the recent example is, I think, our education minister, ex-education minister, had to resign. And one of the reasons he had to resign is because I think there was this edtech company that was close to the prime minister, and the company forced, it kind of bullied, based on the interview, right? It kind of bullied the education minister to buy that software, So, yeah, talking about Nepal's, yeah, private sector, again, as I said, I have these mixed feelings, right? I mean, I want to commend them for doing, making the efforts, laying out the groundwork when the risk is very high, and the Nepali, let's say, market or whatever is kind of volatile, and the government is kind of like very not as supportive, but at the same time, the sense of responsibility and accountability is very low.
Do you think that's also because of the lack of laws that are around the subject matter? If we had, say, adequate laws regarding this, it would be a better situation. And is there any development regarding what kind of laws are required to support this DPI development in the country?
Yeah, so again, in Nepal, right, we have very limited, we don't have like a good privacy framework. We don't have any data protection laws. We have this Electronic Transaction Act and some cybersecurity laws, but they are more not necessarily to protect the citizens, but rather to, protect the authority of the government itself. And yeah, we don't really have good privacy and data protection laws that are actually created putting the privacy and safety of the people itself. So yeah, I think that is one of the major major piece. And talking about laws, because Nepal government recently launched this social network bill, so it looks like, trying to be, instead of being more people centric, I think, like the rest of the world, the government is trying to even more in the, it is putting their more energy to protect itself. The energy, their bandwidth is, directed more towards that. So we hope that in Nepal we have some kind of really robust, people-centric data privacy and data protection laws soon. But we'll see, when we are going to get that.
That brings me back to you, Aarti. So, a lot of major portion of the India stack was developed and implemented in the absence of effective data protection laws. So, are there any steps being taken currently to make the situation better, and whether the data protection law is enough to safeguard the DPI development, or whether there should be particular laws in respect to development of DPIs?
Yeah, thank you for your question. In terms of, I mean, the data protection law in India kind of emerged from the constitutional challenge to DPI. So maybe that's one thing to thank the sort of technology for. And we are seeing positive steps, at least towards, we have the act that's been in place since 2023. And we are seeing reports of the rules also being finalized. Of course, a lot of these are informal documents that circulate, we're not sure. But I think that is, at the very least, regardless of how you see the rules, a very strong step towards ensuring a more robust consent based data sharing ecosystem, which I think is incredibly important in the case of DPI because you're uh, asking citizens to trust you with some of the most sensitive and identifying information about them, which, if in the wrong hands, can be used in the most sort of cruel and nefarious of ways. And in the Indian context as well, I think there are a lot of sensitivities when it comes to social structures that are also captured by data as well. So ensuring that we move towards a consent-based data sharing ecosystem is extremely, extremely important to protect the rights and interests of these vulnerable groups. And like I said, the Data Protection Act is a step in the right direction, and I'm sure it will evolve forward. And we've also seen, I think one of my colleagues, Pavi, is also here. She's done a lot of work on consent-based data sharing within the DPI ecosystem through the DEPA framework. And I think that's also a good sort of initial early step towards creating more privacy respecting ecosystems. So some of the research that we are doing currently at the Quantum Hub looks at the development of DPI ecosystems across the Indo-Pacific. So we're looking at countries like Indonesia, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea, all of which are in very different stages of development, and all of which are looking at DPIs very, very differently, even though they're all technically developing the same thing. And one of the sort of things that we see as a recommendation emerging from our studies of those countries is absolutely, to answer your question, having supplementary legislation to really ensure that the entire ecosystem is robust. Because when you're looking at growing countries with limited digital infrastructure, um, issues like cybersecurity attacks, issues like just not even having enough state capacity, as Dr. Rai was mentioning, to kind of create robust ecosystems. All of these things actually make a huge difference to the success of the project or not, and also make a huge difference in terms of creating public trust in these infrastructures or not. So ultimately, if you want to create ecosystems that people believe in and people want to use and are not forced to use against their will, then you need to have authorizing environments for those specific technologies, whether it's through rules, whether it's through laws, whether it's through policy documents that lay out those principles of trust and care and responsibility. So yeah, I think this is something that we are seeing evolving worldwide. And of course, there are huge implementation gaps in India as well, but I'm hopeful that we will move towards more positive policy work in that space.
Thanks, Ari. Thanks for that. Doctor, I move back to you. You had mentioned in your initial statements about how many people in Nepal were not actually aware about why they were being forced to sign up for digital IDs. So, how do you look at informed consent in this environment, and how do you think, what are the ways in which countries can ensure informed consent is collected, especially in countries where there are lower literacy rates and digital, uh, digital awareness?
Yeah, so there is one thing about, like, the citizens have to be, given the information, given the awareness, right? What is how this national ID is different from, let's say, citizenship ID, or the passport, or how is this, biometric, I mean, what does, this data mean, how sensitive, they might not know the, the gravity of the sensitivity of the data, that is there. And also, yeah, and I think it first starts with the government's clarity itself. So what we have found, the government doesn't have this cohesive vision of why it is trying to launch the national ID, right? And I think for Nepal, it was some kind of like, oh, nationalism, some nation building, how technology is connected to some kind of, this development agenda, looking this very technocratic, this vision of development. I think for the government, it was more like some kind of making some statement, big statement, without kind of like having this very thoroughness of the holistic vision. And I think the main problem lies there, because the government doesn't seem to be clear themselves, so that our implementation has been very erratic and very inconsistent. And other thing, what we have found, that the people who are the implementing bodies, right, from the department, from the, the district level and at the ward level, even the people who were implementing there, like, they were not clear why they were doing it. So it was more like, very ad hoc, and it is just something like, you know so yeah, as I said, I think it first starts with the clarity and commit from the government or the implementing team. And the people who are implementing at different levels, they need to be sensitized and educated. And we need to have this very big, very, not just like a literacy campaign, just some kind of um, you know uh, just just to, have some like this thing, but some kind of like, yeah, sincere commitment towards the literacy program. I think, yeah, we really, see a gap there.
I wanted to ask you about how do you look at the CSO participation in Nepal when it comes to deploying these technologies? Is there enough community participation? Is the government aware about the gender sensitivities that are involved, and the other minority communities, and maybe how to like clearly look at them?
Yeah, so again, we found that the government is not making very proactive, consultation with the civil society organization. And I think when it comes to this, like, the technological interventions, I think most of the civil society organizations are also not that much involved. And I think because maybe it is some lack of, knowledge about the technology itself, right? So we have very few organizations that are actively working in, let's say, digital rights, or, and a lot of the time it's more like a freedom of speech. So I think, we see again in Nepal, we see the gap again in the civil society organization who have some kind of more, um, this insight into, this technological interventions or this kind of framework. And so that's why I think, there is not sufficient pushback. But we see that now people are realizing more, in the past 5 years. I think there is more increasing number of engagement from the civil society and also from the citizen groups, asking for some accountability for inclusion. But again, I would say that this is still not very sufficient. And I think, again, most of the civil society organization, they were working on, let's say, more uh, traditional, you know, issues. I think this again, this DPI, this national ID, digital privacy and consent, I think those whole concepts are again quite new for the civil, a lot of civil society organized itself, maybe, and that is also one of the, I think, one of the issues that we need to address.
Aarti, do you have any thoughts on this? Like, how do we, in India as well, get the government to be accountable and maybe foster in feedback loops in the DPI governance process?
So I think just to sort of add on to Dr. Rai's comment on civil society participation, India has a lot of very good civil society orgs, many of whom are Delhi-based, who are doing a lot of really interesting and vocal work, pushing back against some of the excesses of DPI, whether that's through advocacy or through the legal route. One thing that I think is really important, though, is that this won't have mass kind of participation unless you go to the grassroots and speak to people who are actually impacted by these technologies every day, and create that sense of awareness, create that sense of feedback loop at the grassroots level. Of course, that's the government's job as well. But I also think it's incumbent upon all of us in civil society and in this sort of side of the aisle to really improve our participation with communities, with community leaders, to understand how people are responding to DPIs in whatever form they may be using them, and what more can they be doing to serve people's interests. And I think that is a learning that we have also seen from across the sort of Indo-Pacific, which is largely a developing region as well, whether it's in Indonesia or in Papua New Guinea. Community leaders are your biggest, at the sort of very local level, are your biggest contributors to helping people overcome their fears with technology, A, and B, also creating technologies that are accountable, because community leaders engage with the community, ask questions, relay that feedback, and that's how a lot of governance happens. Of course, it may not be DPI specific, but that is a model that should be applied to DPI related policies and rollouts as well. So on the civil society piece, I think that's a huge thing that we need to be doing in India. Move out of English, move out of Delhi or certain parts of Delhi, and maybe start engaging with people a little more is a really big thing to create long-term accountability. At the government's level, that's a really big question. I'm not entirely sure myself. But I think the best way is to start by, like I said, creating public accountability at the ground level. And that eventually leads to more engagement with these policies and governance structures when they do come out in the public domain. Um, and I think that is the only way, only when there's mass appeal and mass buy-in to these conversations are you able to create pressure for technologies to move a certain way. So I'm maybe, I don't know if this is an idealistic approach, but that's maybe how I see it. And yeah, I'd be excited to learn about what Dr. Rai thinks as well.
I think that's well put. We can only hope to make enough noise to reach to the government and then hope they hear us. So, yeah. So when we look at exporting DPIs again, so what do you think are some elements that should from India that should definitely not be replicated elsewhere, or some things that other countries should definitely watch out for in terms of DPI exportation from the Indian context?
So again, I think again I would just like to push back on the concept of exporting DPI, because I
Hmm.
don't think India is exporting DPI, at least to my knowledge, unless I've missed something. What
Hmm.
we're attempting to do is to assist countries with DPI implementation that they're already doing at their own sovereign level. So that is a sovereign decision that a country is taking that we are trying to participate in. In terms of things that should not be exported, again, because we're only assisting, we can't really export outcomes. But I think a learning from the Indian experience is to not perhaps do things post facto, to not bring in safeguards post facto. And so a lot of our work at the Quantum Hub is essentially looking at how do we develop readiness frameworks and assessment frameworks for countries that are looking to build DPI, policymakers. How do we create assessment frameworks so that um, when you're in your sort of thinking through phase, in your pilot stage, what are the certain issues and gaps that say happen in the Indian context or any other major country's context that we should keep an eye out for, that we can try and prevent in our own home country. And I think those issues and sort of issues that India has faced have probably been explained far better by other people at this conference. I'm not going to go into them right now, but I think that is something that that's also where civil society has a huge role to play. I think is also internationalizing some of the discourse that we've built in India, building relationships with civil society in other parts of the world, such as in these countries that I've been discussing, to share those learnings a little more. Because one thing that we are noticing is that in India, civil society is strong because the DPI conversation is so strong. But in many countries, the DPI conversation is just happening between a handful of institutions and policymakers. There is really no public awareness of what's going on. So that is where your civil society collaborations, maybe doing seminars like this with people in different parts of the world really come in and really help at least start the conversations and create awareness on those things. So those are the things that I would say. I can't say as to what India should or should not export because I don't think that's the approach the government is taking. But I do think some of the learnings from my experience, aside from the very, very beneficial ones that we've had, the critical ones should also be accounted for in readiness frameworks. And hopefully our research can help contribute to some of that.
Dr. Rai, if you like to add on to any of the actual situations that you have seen where DPIs were meant to do something but ended up doing something else, and how how it facilitated exclusion rather than inclusion. If you have any uh, if you have any experiences from Nepal to share with us, we could also
Uh,
hear about that.
Yeah, so the thing is, we had our citizenship policy, right? It was very exclusionary for women, especially who marry the men from other countries. That has been one of the biggest concern. And there are also other very exclusionary practices in our citizenship process. And when national ID was launched, it was actually an opportunity, right, to kind of like uh, to address this issue. But rather than what is happening is like to get the national ID, you need to have a citizenship document. So the people who were kind of excluded from citizenship, they are already excluded from the national ID, the initiative itself. And also like other kind of exclusionary practices that we see for like a marginalized communities, from class, from gender, like the women who don't have their marriage certificate, or their husband there, or people from the disability community, because you have to take the biometric information and they are not given proper, it can be a very humiliating and exclusionary experience for them. Similarly with the people from the queer communities, this kind of very breach of privacy, how uh, the insensitive implementers, they kind of like have this very those kind of interrogations towards them. So we are kind of seeing all these existing exclusive practices kind of not remedied but kind of continued, and actually even amplified by that. So yeah, so that's why like the national ID, and given unlike in India where it is kind of tied to the distribution of services and relief, that's not even the case in Nepal. So yeah, it's really kind of weird situation. What are we doing? Like, we hope that maybe, if they are able to, it will eventually be able to gain some like administrative efficiency. But again, we have that's also yet to see. Yeah.
Are there any existing guidelines for how cybersecurity infrastructure has to be looked at in respect of DPIs in Nepal right now, or is that also something which is being discussed?
Yeah, so as I said, we don't have any data protection policy, and actually, I was going to look at, because it's a huge initiative, but I didn't find any like, again, this data governance system they have talked about. Uh, I looked at the government websites and documents, and they say that, oh, we'll protect your data, but there's, it's just like mentioned very casually. There's no kind of like deliberation, some kind of thoroughness gone into it. So and also like Nepal, our government uh, database has been, been attacked, and this has been kind of very vulnerable to data breaches again and again. So so yeah, that is the situation.
That's also the case in India. Aarti, if you have anything to add on to that with respect to cybersecurity in DPI in India.
Um, well, I think the data leaks speak for themselves. So that is, I don't really know what more to say. I think, again, a lesson that we can learn moving forward is also, and this is some of the recommendations that we are thinking through as an organization, um, is, these are technologies that, for all intents and purposes, are kind of being made mandatory uh, for populations to adopt. So I think they do deserve much higher cybersecurity protections than what they are possibly currently offered under data protection laws. And that's not just the case in India, anywhere across the world, if you're considering technology like this. This is also where a question of perhaps supplementary policy or legislative moves comes in. So one of the things that we've been thinking through is designating DPIs or components of DPIs as critical cyber infrastructure, which are typically held to much higher regulatory standards because they're critical to the sort of running of an ecosystem or country. And I think that, again, coming back to your accountability question, can also create much safer ecosystems where things happen with a lot more precision. And we can kind of avoid the data leaks and the also loss of agency and literal identity that some of our current authorizing frameworks have enabled. So I think moving forward, we need to start thinking if we're going to make these systems population scale, we're going to, for all intents and purposes, make them mandatory for accessing critical services, then we need to start thinking about enhanced cybersecurity protections. And that's something that governments could consider moving forward. Yeah.
I'll actually open the floor to questions now. If there's any question that any of the participants wants to ask, you can unmute your mic and ask the question or post in the chat. Uh, there's a comment in the chat from Sanjina to Dovan ma'am about how e-government's board of Nepal has just shared draft data protection policy a few days back for review, but it has not covered much aspect of DPA and security by design. Maybe that's something you will have to give in your recommendations.
Uh, Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence of the question?
No, there was no question. It's
Oh,
just a comment. It's a comment.
oh, okay, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It has just been released, and we have yet to, like look at it to see what's going on. But yeah.
Is someone typing in? Meantime, I had one final question to both of you. So this is on what does it actually mean to have sovereignty in terms of DPI? for countries, and how do countries look at creating their own models, but at the same time taking inspiration from other countries.
So I think sovereignty kind of it comes down to the literal infrastructure itself. If you look at a lot of the conversations and historical experiences with trying to build digital governance across the world, what you see in developing countries is often that countries have often gotten locked into very long, expensive, and bulky contracts with very large private sector technology companies, often from the West. And what that means for a sort of developing country is you're left with A, expensive infrastructure, and B, infrastructure that's sort of proprietary and not necessarily modular, not necessarily flexible and dynamic and able to adapt with um, technology as it fastly adapts across the decades. So I think that is sort of, and that's also something that I believe a couple of years ago, the Indian government, some representatives also sort of brought up at conferences as well, which is that essentially this is an opportunity for the global south to reclaim its power from large technology companies and also sort of kind of create ecosystems by itself and for itself. So don't quote me on that, but that's sort of a paraphrase just of what was said at the time. So I think that's sort of where a lot of it comes from. A, it's the infrastructure. B, it's also the data. Data is the new oil or water, whatever we want to call it. And all countries are obsessed, A, with keeping it within their country, and B, unfortunately, also using it to kind of control certain, not control, A, to deliver services, but B, to also kind of use it to better monitor and surveil citizens for whatever purposes that may be. And just having access to it within your own boundaries, but within systems that you have developed yourselves, makes it much easier to do that. So I think that is sort of where the concept of data sovereignty really comes from in the context of DPI. There is a lot of international literature around this, and also some sort of literature suggesting that this is far more cost effective in the long run, because obviously a proprietary vendor lock-in situation would be far more costly to a developing country compared to a stack such as the India stack that can be adapted to a domestic context. So that's, I think, broadly, but if you have any other questions or contributions, I'd love to hear.
Uh, yeah, t talking. Oh, sorry. Am I?
You are, go ahead,
Uh,
go ahead. Yeah.
okay, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I was just like, okay. So yeah, talking about the sovereignty, like, I feel like, so for Nepal, I think we need some kind of like sovereignty in terms of like our imagination of technology itself. Because I feel like we have this very like a colonial notion of technology. We think that it's something like, that you import from the West, right? Like you import some smartphone and then you use it. So there's no kind of this very modular or that kind of originality or this kind of, approach to technology. And as a technologist myself, it really pains me that how we have such a very how we view the technology itself. And as I said, like a lot of our development project, this DPI and other digital initiatives have also been kind of like very um, rather than our own innovation, it has been kind of suggested, it had been funded, it had been implemented by all these things. And yeah, and Aarti mentioned that we don't really even value our own data, our um so in a way, Nepal is at this very juncture that we, because we are late in this thing, so we have the opportunity to learn from what went right and what went wrong. But given that our overall critical literacy and the critical, the data literacy is so low, I also fear that the Nepali people are very vulnerable to that. And sometimes I feel, I don't know, sometimes I feel hopeful and helpless at the same time, that we have so much opportunity to do right, but the opportunities are just slipping by, so yeah.
Well, I think it also adds on to the trust factor that you both mentioned earlier about how it can it can also give a feeling of inclusion to the people. There's one question. It says, Benson asked if are there software audits of DPI implementation in India? Aarti, do you want to take
Um,
that?
I'm sure they must happen internally within the state. I don't have visibility on what the process looks like, but I'm sure there would be. There is also under our data protection law provisions for very large data fiduciaries to conduct certain kinds of data impact assessments and audits on their privacy respecting practices as well. But again, whether that applies to DPI entities who are managing all of this, I'm sure they would have different standards as well, which would then be regulated under those respective rules. So, as I don't have visibility on what the process of software audits looks like, but I'm sure it exists internally within the governance structure of the government of India. But that's a great question and something for me to think about more as well.
I guess that's all the questions. Okay, we can have your concluding thoughts on the topic, and then we can look to close the session.
Well, thank you so much, Angela and Dr. Rai, and everyone who came. This was honestly learning about Nepal has been super enriching. As a researcher, we don't, one thing that's really frustrating me and all of my colleagues is there's such little literature on anything outside of, say, certain countries' DPI experiences. So I think it was really excellent to learn firsthand from you about these challenges and opportunities that Nepal is seeing when it comes to DPI and building it out. So thank you, SFSC, for creating that platform of knowledge exchange between Global South practitioners. I think that's been incredibly invaluable. Moving forward, I think ultimately the lesson, like I mentioned earlier, and Dr. Rai as well, is how do you facilitate inclusion when you're building these economies of scale across the world? And I genuinely do believe that it is incumbent on every government to really sit down and think, am I ready for this? And how do I prepare myself for this? So, mapping out who are your most vulnerable communities, mapping out your own deficiencies as a government in areas that you might need assistance with, mapping out areas that you could potentially partner with another country or an institution to get your work done. I think these are steps that can be taken to kind of mitigate some of the negative externalities we've seen from DPI, which can really alter the course of someone's life and create ecosystems for the future that are very inclusive. And I think ultimately it's a question of just creating those relationships with government and seeding those conversations in the long run. And hopefully we can create that ecosystem of trust and inclusion so that people actively choose as much as possible to use this technology and are not fearful or forced to do so. So, yeah, thank you so much for the platform and opportunity.
Thank you. Dr.
Uh,
Rai, over to you.
Yeah, so again, I would really like to thank Angela and SFLC and Pranay, for organizing this very relevant discussion. Again, for me, again, it was very big learning opportunity from Aarathi because I'm kind of in the process of finalizing this NID document. So while I was talking, like, okay, I need to look, I was keeping this mental note that I have to look at this person. As you said, like, there's not a lot of work or, research or a literature review, and just to get information is really really difficult. And so for Nepal, again, I don't know, like, I might sound kind of a little frustrated with what's going on, but so again, this is not some kind of like my this is again my personal opinion. But what I feel where Nepal stands today is we have 30 million population, and that's not necessarily a small population. But I think because of the huge migration, and even the people who are here, they are looking, forward to, go abroad. So it feels a little bit of kind of this citizen engagement, kind of like slowing down, and given when actually we need more, as Aarti mentioned, right, the change is only possible when the everyday citizen, we have a lot of grassroots movement. But then I think we had a series of political movements, and a lot of people have been kind of fatigued, going through the movement and being disillusioned, so this kind of disillusionment and fatigue, and a lot of younger generation, because of, we know all this attention economy and everything, everybody's distracted. So and again, because of our education system and the critical media literacy, I don't think that in Nepal, again, this is not to undermine the work that is being done, not to undermine the people and the organizations that are on the ground. But I really feel like in Nepal, we really lack the critical, I don't know, the critical mass to really champion this the voices and the actions to really counter the impending risk. So for me, I really, through body and data, and even through my own initiative, I'm really looking forward to have kind of this conversation in the global south, in South Asia particularly, right? To learn from each other, to kind of build this kind of network and momentum. So and I think the problem is very complex, right? So I don't think it is very and I think it makes sense to have this very regional collaborations to even analyze, to study each other, and maybe build momentum, to help each other. I have really come to the conclusion for that. So, and one of the reason I kind of agreed to participate in the panel itself. So again, thank you so much for the organizer and for all the participants.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was actually quite touching. Um, so I would like to conclude today's session by that. Thank you for bringing in regional context into this discussion of DPI in conversations. And it's great to be reminded that we shouldn't just be looking at development of technologies, but also on the context of rights and learning from each other's shared experiences. I hope today's session has sparked some new questions in all of you. Thank you to all the participants for joining today. I also invite you all to tune in tomorrow for our final day of DPI in Conversations. This is a panel discussion on governing digital public infrastructure. It will be moderated by Pranay, Volunteer Council from SFLC.in, and the panelists are Caroline Rossini, Disha Verma from TGI, and Saujanya Sridharan from Aarthi Institute. Thank you. And Luca Belli from FGV Law School. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow.